Let's talk about victimology. So we're going to set up a scenario. It's me and my neighbor. And I live in a tent. And my neighbor lives in a mansion. We're going to go through two scenarios. The first one is one in which I live in a tent because I can't build a mansion. I could kind of lay a concrete foundation. Maybe I could stick some metal poles in the concrete and I could make a glorified tent. Maybe with some education and practice, I could even make a log cabin. I could make some form of primitive structure. I just couldn't make a mansion. If I tried to make a mansion, it would be a joke. It would be a joke and it would fall down and kill everybody inside, and that would be sad. So, it's probably best for everyone involved if I resign myself to my position or try to improve, but there is no benefit to me being resentful toward my neighbor, toward coveting my neighbor's mansion. My neighbor has a mansion because my neighbor is good at building things. My neighbor is talented. My neighbor built up the capital to be able to build this mansion because they're extraordinary. They're better than me in terms of mansion building. And so they basically deserve this mansion. I haven't earned the mansion. I've done nothing of note. I've lived a mediocre life, a transient life, eating sort of hand to mouth. And I've never done anything to warrant a mansion. So I don't deserve a free mansion. And I shouldn't be resentful toward my neighbor. This metaphor basically describes the conservative capitalist outlook in America. It says people who are less well off should not be jealous or resentful toward people who are more well off. And this is their worldview and their explanation of why. But there's an alternative scenario. In this scenario, I try to build a mansion, but every time I try to start the building process, some hired thugs come along and they burn down my mansion. Now, unbeknownst to me, these hired thugs actually are employed by the rich guy across the street, my neighbor. Now, why does he keep burning my house down? Well, he hates me. He's hated me for thousands of years, and he wants to destroy me. Furthermore, if I got a mansion too, his mansion would look less impressive. In fact, he knows that my mansion would overshadow his mansion, that currently people look toward his mansion as a symbol of power. And they say, oh wow, he has a beautiful mansion, he must be a wonderful man, and we should all perhaps elect him to be mayor. So he knows that his power lies in the symbology of his mansion, that if he maintains this mansion for himself and he prevents other people from getting a mansion, he knows he's going to remain in power. That's his goal. He can't suffer competition. He has to have a mansion monopoly. So he has to essentially censor anybody who opposes him. He has to kill the competition. So whenever I start, and I'm a persistent guy, every month I start again and again trying to build up scaffolding, trying to begin this process of making a mansion. I have great plans, great blueprints, but every time, maybe I get a week into the project, maybe I get a month into the project, but time and time again, his hired thugs, his hired goons, they come and they burn down my house. They burn down my mansion. Now the conservative comes up to me and says, you shouldn't be resentful toward the man with the better mansion. It's your fault for being mediocre. He's just more talented. He's a better person. He deserves that mansion. Now, if I came along and said, this hired goon problem, these arsonists who come and burn down my house, I've actually hired a private investigator. I've done my research. I set up some security cameras, and I discovered who these guys are, and I hired a private investigator to follow them around. And it turns out that every Saturday at 5 p.m., these hired goons meet the owner, my neighbor, the owner of the mansion, and he gives them a briefcase full of money. Every Saturday at 5 p.m. this happens after my house is burned down. I've been noticing this trend, noticing this pattern. In fact, it's been happening for a few years now. I would say, in fact, hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. This has been going on over and over again. And so I've called the police, and the police have called me a conspiracy theorist. And then I tried contacting media outlets, and they called me crazy, and they called me schizophrenic, and they said I was in a dark place, and that I should stop blaming my personal problems on other people. So I contacted everyone, and nothing worked. And then I decided to start, going to town hall meetings and speaking out about what the problem was with the mayor, how he kept burning my house down. No one wanted to listen to me, and those who did listen to me were called fringe extremists. They were called fringe extremists. Because, most people aren't having their house burnt down, so it's not in their interest to speak out on the issue. And they think, well, I could speak out and then be silenced and then have all these negative consequences, or I could just try to do my best with what I have. So these are basically the two views of the world. Now, what's interesting here is I didn't necessarily bring race or ethnicity or politics into my metaphor. The first one, I think, is pretty clearly a capitalist conservative position. That's a status quo position. That's the dominant position. But the latter metaphor describes several different types of people. And it describes black people, and it describes white nationalists. Now, this has been pointed out before. I think people like Sargon and Akkad have pointed out, wow, the way that white nationalists talk about Jews, and these pro-white people, the way they talk about Jews is the same exact way that black people talk about white people. And that's an interesting parallel. The point here is that we obviously understand, I've given you two examples, two metaphors. We obviously understand that the metaphor could correspond to empirical reality. Like the story I've told, it's plausible that something like this could happen. Maybe not the exact scenario, but something like this could happen. Obviously, we have cases in which someone is mediocre and they blame a superior person for their problems, and they're resentful. And they're resentful for no good reason, and that resentment helps nobody, and it doesn't improve the world. In fact, they should spend less time being resentful and more time being productive, and then their life would be better. Everyone would be better off. So we obviously see times where the conservative or the status quo position is correct. We see times when people use victimology, or a mythology of victimhood. They use it incorrectly. Victimology does not always correspond to reality. There are cases in which people are just mediocre, and they blame their problems on other people. They scapegoat other people. And this is what people say about the Nazis and the Jews, that the Nazis scapegoated the Jews for all their problems. They saw falling birth rates in Germany, they blamed it on the Jews. They saw race mixing in Germany, and they blamed it on the Jews, with the Rhineland bastards. They saw the degradation of art in Germany. They blamed it on the Jews. They saw the homogeneity of media, that media was being bought up by these large corporations, and they blamed that on the Jews. They saw a decline in morality, sexual morality. They saw a rise of prostitution. They blamed it on the Jews. They saw the defeat of Germany in World War I. They blamed it on the Jews. So there's a whole list of problems that they blamed on the Jews. The question is that an example of scapegoating? Or is that an example of an actual depiction of reality? Because we do know there are occasions where monopoly powers will abuse people they view as a threat, and then they will call those people to gaslight them, and they'll say, oh, you're not being abused, you're just crazy. That's what gaslighting is. So that can happen, and then you can also have people, I think you can have black supremacists, or people who will say things like, Plato was a black man, and European civilization comes from black people. Europeans stole civilization from Africa. They can say this, and they can blame the mediocrity of African countries on white people. They can do that. So victimology, or the mythos of victimhood, when I use that term mythos and mythology, I'm just talking about a narrative and a story with an inherent telos. So I could tell you a story, I could say the chicken crossed the road. It's not a mythology because there is no telos. Now if I say the chicken crossed the road because the cat was chasing him, and then the cat got hit by a car. Now we're more approaching a mythology, because I'm saying, well, because of the greed of the cat, he was focused on the chicken and he wasn't looking at the incoming danger. So there is a kind of telos in that, saying that you should, or a moral, an ethos, that you should be more concerned about protecting yourself than focused on the prey. Just saying the chicken crossed the road, I guess that's technically a story. It doesn't have any inherent ethos. It doesn't have any inherent telos. But once you add enough to the narrative, enough to the story, that there is an inherent ethos or telos, then it becomes mythos. And when you have mythos, mythos may or may not correspond with empirical reality. There are cases in which you have someone, a have and a have-not, a bourgeoisie and a proletariat, an oppressor and an oppressed. There are cases where there are people who are legitimately discriminated against because some people want to maintain a monopoly of power. So this, in the context of a right-left dialectic, is very interesting to me. Because the right wing in America, the mainstream right wing, is all about conservatism. It's all about saying victimology is always false. That is the narrative of the mainstream media. If you ever have less than your neighbor, you are always at fault. No one was ever oppressed ever. That's basically the simplified, dumbed-down version of mainstream conservatism. Now they'll make little addendums and little exclusions to that overall mythology. They'll say, well, slavery was bad, this was bad, that was bad. But a hardcore, extreme mainstream conservative would be someone who says, if there's something wrong in your life, it's always your fault. No one did anything to cause that. No one is oppressing you. This is the mainstream conservative narrative. But what is the opposite of that is victimology. But victimology can be used by social justice warriors, by the left, by the black community, but it also can be used by pro-white people. Both people can use victimology. And so basically I oppose conservatism on the grounds that conservatism is axiomatically opposed to victimology. There are times, there are places when victimology is true, victimology is correct, victimology is right. There are clearly times in history when you have people who oppress others, who try to maintain a monopoly, when they don't necessarily have the merit to deserve all that they obtain through that monopoly. A good example is in the case of monarchies, when you have a monarch who is degenerate, who, maybe he had some ancestors who won some battles, but the monarch himself, he has genetic defects, he has mental problems, he has below average IQ, all sorts of problems with the monarch. He's simply instated because he happens to be a descendant, because he happens to be the first in line. But he's not the most meritorious. He's not the one who deserves to rule the country. He didn't win the position through his talent. He won the position through an accident of circumstance. And because of compounded incestuous cousin marriages and whatever, he turns out to be a genetic freak, a deformed freak, and he's not capable of ruling the country. We know there are historical cases where you have rebellious populations, and this is what the Freemasons in America were doing. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, they were saying, this is not how government should be. Government should not be ruled by deformed, freakish monarchs. Government should be ruled by the most meritorious people. And we're going to come up with a republican system of how to select people by merit. So the founding of the American Revolution was itself a victimology. So in that sense, I find American conservatism to be deeply, inherently contradictory, because it is axiomatically anti-victim. Whenever there is a victim, it always blames the victim, and it always assumes the victim is wrong. That's not axiomatically true. And this actually, in its extreme, morphs into a post-American conservatism, into a neoliberalism or a neoconservatism. Neoliberals and neoconservatives, in the extreme sense, they're not American nationalists. They don't care about America, preserving America. They're globalists who see the whole world as like, well, if you're on top, if you're in the 1%, if you're a billionaire, if you're a millionaire, if you fit into the system, if everything's going good for you, then you're doing it right. And if you feel like the modern world, if you feel like capitalism, if you feel like globalism is disadvantaging you, then you're a loser and you deserve to die. And that's the position of a lot of neoconservatives and people like Tim Wise, who will say, I guess he would be a neoliberal in this case, but Tim Wise will say things like, white people, if they can't integrate, if they don't accept multiculturalism, they deserve to die. Their purity will not live on. They will turn into, their descendants will not be white anymore. They will turn into some different race. And that they deserve that for all the terrible things they've done. They're the losers of history. So I actually am more sympathetic to people who are on the left, who are victimologists. Because, some of these people go the opposite direction, right? Then they say you must always side with the victim. You must always believe the victim. Now, that's very problematic, especially with the Me Too movement and all these sexual accusations. It's obviously not the case that whenever a woman says she's been raped, that she's correct. So, for instance, if a liberal or a conservative woman accuses Robert Mueller of sexual assault, we know that we can't just believe her. We actually have to investigate the claim. Is it true? Is it false? So you can't always believe the victim. Victimology is not axiomatically true. I find that it's much more easy when you're on top, when you're in a privileged position, when you're like Marie Antoinette, who says, let them eat cake, right? You can just say, well, if they're not successful, it's their own fault. That's a self-justification. That's a way to put aside the burden of empathy. Empathy is a burden. If you feel empathy toward other people, that's a burden you have to carry. And some people who are in positions of power, they will rationalize away their empathy. And they'll say, well, if other people suffer, it's their own fault. But when you're not in that top 1% position, it's very difficult to do that. And you have to accept that some people are victimized. Some people are victims of a system that doesn't care about them. And so fundamentally, I guess, I see a lot more sense and goodness in the left in that sense than in the right, where the right is defined by, if something bad happened to you, it must be your fault. You should just pick yourself up by your bootstraps and get better, versus the left is actually willing to say, no, there are powerful people, and powerful people have eternally abused their power, and they have always sought to abuse the competition and maintain their monopoly status. This is how Bill Gates, one of the, I don't know how to describe him other than a person who became wealthy by discouraging competition. Every time someone tried to make an improvement on the Microsoft software, he would sue them. He would block the competition. He would say it's a violation of copyright law. Of course, copyright law was invented to encourage invention, not to disincentivize it. But that's exactly what Bill Gates did. He became rich by establishing a monopoly on software. And everyone else was blown out of the water. They didn't have the money to overturn the lawsuit. And this is one of the problems with our justice system, is we have a justice system that's controlled by a system of private lawyers who, depending on how much money you have, determines whether you get a good private lawyer or a bad private lawyer. And if you have enough money, that good private lawyer can find some loophole in our, some people would call it Talmudic, other people would call it Byzantine, but you have a law system that is so, it's so disassociated from personality and from humanity. And it's so, it has its own internal logic that's completely separate from any notion of justice. And the lawyers who are smart enough, they can figure out the loophole and they can get you whatever you want legally. And if they're not smart enough, then they can't figure it out and you lose. And that the determination of whether you get the smart or the dumb lawyer is through money alone. And so this money power reinforces itself through this mercantile justice system. We don't have trial by combat, right? That's the warrior ethos. In Scandinavia, if two people had a disagreement, ancient Scandinavians would have trial by combat. They'd say, you know, you called me a coward, so now one of us is going to kill the other. And that's going to determine who the real coward is. That happened all the time. People were, in fact, it was a profitable venture. If you were crazy enough or strong enough, you could just challenge random people. You could just challenge kings and say, I think you're a coward, let's fight. And the winner is going to, you know, win some sort of property. I'm going to challenge you for ownership of your house. That was a justice system based around a warrior class who was the strongest in battle, which is kind of crazy. Like, obviously, you can't run a civilization on that. Partially why Scandinavia maintained its Paleolithic status for so long, and it failed to enter civilization until the fall of the Roman Empire. And they were living in this primitive state. It's not because they were unintelligent. It's not because they were stupid. It's because they had this warrior ethos that you can't build anything, you can't build wealth because someone could just walk up to you and challenge you to combat and steal all your wealth. So there was no way to build up wealth and to build up civilization, and so people were living in a much more primitive state than, you know, in Rome, where they had literacy and they had poetry and they had the Colosseum, because they were able to build up wealth because the justice system was not based around the warrior class. But when everything is so mercantile, then justice really depends on how much money you have. So, you know, there's like a fundamental, from a class analysis and from a mythological analysis, I'm much more sympathetic to the left in America than the right. Now, the American right in itself is a particular iteration of what we would call the right wing. And what I try to look at is a deeper, a universal, a perennial perspective of right versus left, not as, well, if you're dominant, if you control the power structure, you're right wing, and if you're the underdog, you're the left wing. And I think that's a great way, this concept of victimology is a great way to analyze how people politically identify, how we identify right wing versus left wing. There was a great video made by the Distributist on Mencius Moldbug, and he did it's like an hour-long summary of the blogging of Mencius Moldbug over several years, over a time period. And he does a great job of dissecting left versus right, although he doesn't introduce this class element, which I think is so vitally important, because the class element, it's Spenglerian in the sense that it transcends an individual culture, an individual civilization, and you can analyze all kinds of peoples, all kinds of cultures and civilizations and societies across the world, and you can analyze hypothetical situations, and you can analyze historical and contemporary situations through this lens. And it's something that doesn't exclude an ethnic or racial component. It doesn't exclude a religious component for an explanatory mythos of how a society grows or stagnates or decays. It doesn't exclude that, but it sort of overlaps, and it contains many different factors within itself, and then it compounds those factors, and I feel it really just opens things up. So the Moldbug explanation for why the right wing keeps losing and why the left wing keeps winning essentially came down to technology. But where does technology come from? Technology doesn't come from nowhere. Technology comes from mythology and metaphysics. And you see this when you look at the early inventors of the scientific worldview or the technological worldview, the early adopters of the scientific method. They had a certain mythology, and they were of a certain class. And the more and more I look back at the Greek rationalists, the people who hated astrology because they said everything has to be empirical, that was actually the late stage of Greek society. When Alexander the Great made this huge conquest, we view that as such a huge victory, and therefore we would assume that the period of conquest under Alexander the Great was the height of Greek civilization. That when the Greeks conquered Afghanistan, that was the height of Greek civilization. But actually it was the fall and the decline of Greek civilization, because the Greeks were now looking through an empirical lens. They were now looking through a rationalist lens. They were rejecting their tradition. They were becoming unrooted from their tradition. And that conquest of Alexander was sort of, if you think about it, Greek culture at that point had been compressing the string. It had been building up potential energy. And the ejaculatory, invasive expansion of Alexander was the last gasp of breath for Greek civilization. And after that, it was in perpetual decline. Up until the present day, when we think of Greece as the periphery of Europe, periphery of power, rather than a locus and a center of power. And we have to think about that in terms of the present day, that at the contemporary moment, Western civilization seems all powerful. It seems like it's poised to just dominate the world, and everything's westernizing, everything's Americanizing. And that's how people view America. America's the strongest country in the world. The best days are ahead of us. And we can do anything we want. We're the superpower. We can destroy any country. We could destroy Russia. We could take over Iran. We could do whatever we want. We can invade Venezuela. But I think we're coming to an end of the American-centered, Western-centered dominance. And we're seeing a rise, a resurgence of China and India. I just watched a little population map. It shows the population of the Earth over time. And basically, Africa, South America are barren. They're barren wastelands. No one lives there. And the centers of population are India, China, and to a lesser extent, Europe. And so India and China have always had a place in terms of population. Europe has not had this prominence compared to India and China until recent times. There was a rise, there was a fall, and we're kind of in the free fall scenario now. The question, it's an interesting scenario for someone to be a Westerner who is simultaneously being oppressed by, the multiculturalism of the West, this unique invention of the West, suppressed by that. So in a sense, the average Western male is oppressed by the system, is a victim of the system. But on the other hand, you have all these aggressive foreign hostile entities within Western civilization who are then accusing the Western male of being the oppressor. So he's being attacked from all sides. He's being attacked by the power structure on top, from the top down, and he's being attacked by all of these sycophants of the system, all of these victims of the system, as the oppressor himself. So he's being squeezed from both sides in a sort of a sandwich effect. That's an interesting scenario to be in, because on the one hand, you have these American patriots, these CIA operatives, who they're fighting for the American dream, fighting for the American way, and destroying the average Western male through their policies, through the deep state, through the metacultural and metapolitical activities and psychological operations. They're destroying, they're attacking the average Western male. And so the reaction to that is, well, I guess I'm opposed to the government. I guess I'm opposed to this Western empire. And that's kind of what Kurt Doolittle has been promoting. That's what the Traditionalist Workers' Party promoted, this anti-imperialism, anti-Westernism, this accelerationism. We have to bring down the government. But on the other hand, you have people on the left who are attacking Western males. And so the instinctive reactionary impulse is to say, stop attacking America, stop attacking who I am, stop attacking my identity, and that pushes people back toward the conservative side of things. So you're sort of in a middle path where, you can't really embrace the status quo because that's oppressing you, but you also can't really embrace the left because they're also acting as foot soldiers of the elite to oppress you. So you're squeezed from both sides. You're being robbed by the federal government with your tax money going to programs designed to destroy you. And then you're also being literally robbed by, your neighborhoods in diverse areas. Now, from my perspective, I guess it kind of depends on where you're living. If you're living in an extremely diverse, vibrant area, you might identify more with the government. And I think oftentimes that's, you look at some of these southern states, these Republican states, these patriotic states, places like West Virginia, places like rural Georgia, rural Louisiana, white parts of the South, they identify as patriots. We're patriotic people. We support George W. Bush. We support these foreign wars. Partially because the oppression that they feel is mostly from the diversity. It's from bottom-up oppression, that the diversity of masses against the individual. But then people who live in less diverse areas, I would expect that they wouldn't care so much about, and this is sort of my outlook, is that generally I'm not so scared about a Muslim blowing me up, which is what a lot of white people in the South seem to be afraid of. Oh, those Muslims are going to blow us up. I'm not afraid of Muslims blowing me up. And in fact, I would be happy to live among all other kinds of people, live in a multicultural space, so long as I had my own autonomy, my own freedom, and I had the rights and the liberties afforded to other peoples, and there was a form of equality, not equity necessarily, but a form of equality, just saying that, okay, so black people can have the black caucus, Hispanic people have the Hispanic caucus, and white people have the white caucus. If we had that sort of scenario, I would be happy with that, living in a society where there are all kinds of groups of people, but each kind of group of people could have, you could have the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and you could have the National Association for the Advancement of White People. If we lived in that kind of society where it was not taboo for white people to advance white interests, then I wouldn't mind the fact that it was a multiracial or a multicultural society. That wouldn't bother me so much. What bothers me is when you have an elite, when you have Google, when you have these corporate monopolies who are censoring people, who are making it socially unacceptable through a mythological brainwashing process through the media by imprinting gaslighting messages on liberal white people, gullible white people, psychologically authoritarian white people, imprinting this message that it is socially unacceptable, it's evil, it's Hitlerian to ever talk about white interests. So to me, that seems to be the greater threat, the mythological component. If a Muslim comes and blows me up, I'm not actually sad about that. Again, I guess it's unfortunate from the perspective of everyone has people who rely on them, who depend on them, you have responsibilities. But if a Muslim blows me up, it's like, well, I guess tough luck there. The shark attacks happen, people die from lightning, and people die from Muslims blowing people up. It's not a serious concern of mine. And I don't really sympathize with the people who are concerned about that, or people who are really concerned about black on white crime. Black on white crime does happen, but again, it's not so prevalent as to be oppressive. Now, maybe if I lived in a 90% black neighborhood, I would feel differently about that. But from my position, I think that what's really important is the mythology and the structural power, and how people have that structural power. So, in a sense, I'm more sympathetic to the left in terms of, I see the real problem as starting with this top-down mythological imprinting that comes from the corporate media that is owned by a billionaire class of merchants, that makes it impossible for us to even have an honest conversation about who are we, what are our interests, because the moment you ever speak some common sense about these issues, you're instantly shut down as the worst possible person. No one should associate you. You don't even have the right to a job. So all of that I view as the biggest obstacle. Again, I view capitalism as a result of a change in metaphysics, as a change in how people were thinking. And I think that change in thinking resulted in the rise of a merchant class, resulted in the rise of capitalism. I don't think that capitalism obviously, there's a positive feedback loop between the results of capitalism and the merchandising mentality itself, the merchandising class. There's a feedback loop there. There's cause and effect, but ultimately you have to have the merchandising outlook, this empirical outlook, this rationalist outlook, in order to get a capitalist economy running that can then reinforce itself through a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop, depending on how you look at it. But clearly there is a sort of feedback going on where the more capitalist we become, the more merchandising people become in their psychology and their spirituality and their metaphysics. But the metaphysics is primary and the mythology is primary, and that's how I view these political questions. And so ultimately, I think politically, if you're saying you're a pro-white person, you're not on the American right wing. You can't be on the American right wing. Now, maybe in a deeper sense, you can be part of a deep right. And that's what I talk about, okay, we have to accept hierarchy. We have to accept, a class system. We can't just be complete egalitarians, right? So there is a deep right, a more perennialist right that sort of undergirds all of this American-specific contemporary stuff. But within the American context, if you're pro-white, you could be right-wing on a deeper sense, in a deeper level, looking at civilization as a whole, a Spenglerian right-wing, stepping back from America in its specific iteration. But just looking at America, if you're pro-white, you can't be on the right wing, because the right wing says victims are to blame, the people in power are always correct, and the people in power are the most anti-white people, and they are the one creating white liberalism. White liberals don't invent white liberalism, they're taught white liberalism by people who control the public schools, who control the media. So you first have to address those people, and I think the only way to do that in the American context is to be in the left wing. You have to be left wing. You have to challenge the power. You can't be right wing. Now that's contradictory to a lot of people, because white people have been shuffled into the right wing. They've been shuffled because white people have been told that you're the dominant ethnic group, and so you should attach yourself to this concept that victimology is incorrect, and just hang on to that. And if you can just hang on to that, then hopefully these other people are going to give up their victimology and they're going to assimilate. That, of course, is not going to happen. So I don't think that's a successful strategy for the average white person. Now, if you're rich, if you're a billionaire, attacking victimology is a great way to stay in power. Gaslighting victims is a great way to stay in power. But if you're not in power, then you are, by default, within the particular circumstance, you're on the left wing of that power structure. And again, you can have an objective third position not a third position, but you can have like a bird's eye view and say, well, on a deeper level, even though within the context of American politics, I might find myself in a left-wing position politically, psychologically I'm more right-wing. Psychologically, I'm more conservative. Psychologically, I'm more traditionalist. But within the specific iteration, I find myself on the left politically. So we have to distinguish, we have to untangle what does it mean to be an authoritarian economically or a libertarian economically versus what does that mean culturally? What does that mean psychologically? Because those are all different things. And we have to distinguish, we can't just conflate them. We have to distinguish what it means to be right-wing, left-wing in the American context. We have to distinguish what it means in a broader racial context. We have to distinguish what it means in a philosophical or a metaphysical context, because we can get different results, different answers in all of those cases. And again, I would even say Moldbug, whether he's right-wing or left-wing is up for debate, but at least the people who read him, who are inspired by him, oftentimes those can be people who are on the political left, in the sense of they are the underdogs. They are not part of the ruling class, and they're looking to change the power structure. Essentially, within a political system, right-wing means pro-status quo, and being left-wing means against the status quo, wanting to change the ruling power structure. So if you're seriously challenging the status quo, you are, by my definition, on the left wing. Now there are deeper, if you take away the specific context, the specific iteration, we can talk about what left and right mean in a metaphysical sense, what they mean in relation to class, what they mean in relationship to tradition versus progress, what they mean in relation to memetics versus genetics, what they mean in relation to all sorts of issues. And in that we can have a real discussion of what it means to truly be right-wing, left-wing, when we step back from a specific American context or a specific contemporary context. All of this is very contradictory, and it's not, it's contradictory in its it's I want to say that the words right wing or left wing, they're confusing to people because I'm using them in different ways when they're applied to different levels of society. So if we're just looking purely at the American context, I'm going to use the terms right wing and left wing differently than if I'm looking at the grand scheme of history. If we're looking at the Roman Empire, who are the right wing influences? Who are the left wing influences? Who's right wing or left wing? It is confusing, and I would hope and I would wish, and I'm asking for a new structure of semantics. If you buy into this right-wing versus left-wing dichotomy, you often get fooled and tricked through semantic trickery and associations. You get fooled into supporting the powers that are oppressing you. And so you get right-wing people who say, well, I don't like being attacked as a white male by the left, so I'm going to then associate myself with capitalism, and capitalism is going to safeguard me and protect me, and that's my team. Go team capitalism. You've just been tricked into supporting the system that has created the people who are attacking you. So that's a huge flaw that we need to somehow step outside of the right-wing, left-wing dichotomy and have different words to talk about this. Status quo versus rebellion. We need to talk about, pro-white versus anti-white. We need to talk about hierarchy versus egalitarianism. We need to talk about victimology. And so it's just not the case that victims are always wrong. It's not always the case that victims are always right. And I guess you can call that a big brain centrist take, or a realist take, or I'm not sure. But you can take a mythology, and I wanted to do this. I wanted to do a video where I take the Bible and I treat it like Mad Libs, because sometimes that happens. You can take the 12 tribes of Israel and you can say, well, the 12 tribes of the Indo-Europeans. So you have the Germanic tribe, the Celtic tribe, the Slavic tribe, you have the Illyrian tribe, you have the Tocharian tribe, the Armenian tribe, the Greek tribe, the Italic tribe. I'm sure I'm forgetting some other tribes. We could add some other tribes in there. Distinguish between the Albanian tribe and or we could do it specifically with Germanics. We could say, well, there's the Visigothic tribe and the Ostrogothic tribe. There's the Vandal tribe, and there's the Swedish and the Norwegian, and we could come up with all sorts of little tribes. You could say it's just like the 12 tribes of Israel, and then you could say, well, Israel's the homeland of the Jewish people. Germany is the homeland of the Germanic people. We could say Jerusalem is the holy city of the Jews. Well, Berlin is the holy city of the Germans. You could say, there are these patriarchs of the Jews. Well, the German people had Karl the Great, Charlemagne. They had Pippin. They had, Henry the Fourth. They had all kinds of leaders. They had, the guy who defeated the Romans in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, Arminius. Arminius was a patriarch of the German people. So we can form all these mythological analogies, and we can see that a mythology it's very subjective, right? When a Jewish people have a mythology about their patriarchs and their tribes and their holy places, then that to them is true. But if I did the same thing, if I took the Bible and I said, instead of the Amalekites being the evil enemies of the German people, we'll call them the Slavs. The Slavs are the evil enemies of the German people who are taking it. I mean, it's funny because it fits so neatly in some cases. And you could do this, and it would be much better as a standalone video if I actually wrote it out and thought it out beforehand. But it's interesting to me because, again, you could set up these two mythologies, and a Jewish person can read the Bible and say, this is absolutely true. This is what I believe. But then I could take the entire Bible, I could rewrite it. So instead of being located in Israel, it's located in Germany, and just change some place names, change some names of the people, and I could rewrite the Bible to be all about Germany. In fact, this has been done throughout history. People have done this in one way or another. I think it's the Oralinda Bible is the name. It's about the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is the holy sacred land of the Germanic peoples, and it's this whole mythology about it. Although there's some matriarchy thrown in there, some weird concepts. But anyway, we could do this, and then a German person could say, yeah, this is the true Bible, and a Jewish person would be horrified. They'd say, how can you describe Slavic people as Amalekites? How can you say that you want to exterminate them? That's disgusting. And they say, well, you guys have your Bible where you talk about, instead of the Slavic people, you say slaughter the Amalekites. They say, well, yeah, that's from God. Okay, it's not that we want to do that. It's that God commanded us to do that. And this is totally different, right? So we weren't trying to kill these people, but God commanded us to because they were so evil. And we can rationalize this thing all day. But that's the fundamental takeaway I have from this, is that mythology is subjective. And mythology is the ultimate truth to different people. And mythology is what organizes people and creates a telos for people. It creates an ethos, and it structures our behavior. And our behavior results from our mythology. And you can switch identities. You can say, well, instead of Abraham, we're going to talk about Arminius or Charlemagne. And it's the same structure, it's the same skeleton, it's even perhaps the same metaphysic you could take, but you've switched around the identities of the people, the ethnic identity, the linguistic identity, the historical identity. You've swapped that around, you've created something that would horrify the original believers in that mythos. So you've kept the same structure. That's the problem. Mythology is not universal. Mythology is particular to the actors and the identities within that mythos. Mythology is particular to a certain ethnos. And mythology could, be warped, and it could be spread. And so this is how I look when you do comparative mythology, and you look, oh, well, isn't it funny how Zeus fights the Titans and Odin fights the giants? Isn't there something funny about how those are parallel? Well, what happened, in my opinion, is you had Indo-Europeans who had one religion or one mythology, and that later, because the Germans and the Italic peoples, the Mediterranean peoples, they separated. They had linguistic separation. They changed languages because of their influence with the substrates of the area. So the Germanic people encountered the native inhabitants of Scandinavia who were not Indo-Europeans. The Italic people, the same thing. They encountered Etruscans, and this changed the languages, but they maintained that mythology through the ages, and the mythology was more powerful, and the mythology was, that structure of the mythology was more intact than the languages themselves. So a German speaker couldn't understand Italian, an Italian speaker couldn't understand German, or I guess I should say Latin, if we're talking about the ancient case. But, a Romance speaker couldn't understand a Germanic speaker. Not mutually intelligible in terms of the linguistic structure. But the mythological structure was still similar enough that you had Romans who were saying, oh yeah, those German people, they worship Mercury. And they were talking about Thor. But they would say, oh yeah, they worship Mercury. So the mythological structure was still there. It hadn't been obliterated. You would think that if you have so much time and so much separation and so much mutation between two cultural groups, that surely if the language changes, language is so much deeper than mythology. We think of mythology as something that is a organization of language. That if you string enough words together, then you get a mythology. And so the idea is that language is the bedrock. Language is the down here stuff. That's the foundation of the pyramid. Then you build language up and up and up, and eventually you get the crowning achievement with it, which is mythology. So if you have enough language, you'll eventually get a mythology. So if that's the case, and you radically change the language so it's not mutually intelligible, then there's no way that the mythology, according to the butterfly effect, where you change a small thing in the base conditions, chaos theory, you change a small little thing in the base conditions, the result, the cumulative result, should be radically different if it's all just random. But it's not just random. That mythology informed the metaphysic. That metaphysic was selected for. And so even though there was random change in the language, the German languages, the Romance languages are different. They're not mutually intelligible. There was linguistic drift, there was linguistic mutation that separated the two tribes. So they differed from one another linguistically because at the end of the day, the differences in language between Germans and Romance speakers was not enough to warrant, or Italic speakers, it was not enough to warrant a change in the survivability of their culture. We can speak Latin or we can speak German, and that's not necessarily going to determine whether we succeed or fail as a culture. But the metaphysic and the founding mythos was maintained because that was integral to the structure of those societies. That's something very interesting to me, that actually we think of mythology as a higher ordering, as an emergent structuring of basic linguistic blocks, the phonemes and the morphemes or whatever, that you have enough of this language. You know, you have a monkey at a typewriter typing away, eventually he's going to come up with Shakespeare. But actually, it seems to be the reverse. It seems to be that mythology is a more basic and potent. It's a more structurally stable component than language itself, linguistics itself. Language is mutable. We can speak Greek or Italian or German, but we can still have the same underlying mythology, the same underlying metaphysic. It's much more similar than the linguistic similarity, which is not what you would expect from just a materialistic systems analysis of, okay, well, the language is the underlying building blocks, and then the result is the mythology. It's more like a programming language where you could program a video game using C++, you could use Python, you could use JavaScript, you have a different language, but the ultimate telos remains the same. You're trying to create a video game, and you could have 3 different video games which are very similar, but had 3 different programming languages. So a very different linguistic structure to the 3 different video games, but they all converge in this convergent evolution in the same thing. In the case of Greek, Romans, and Germans, it's not that they converged on the idea of Zeus or Jupiter or Odin as fighting against the Titans or the giants. It's not that they converged on that, but it's that they originated from the Indo-Europeans ancestrally, that was passed down through tradition, and they maintained it due to this selective pressure. And, you know, that might be an evolutionary pressure. What is the mechanism that maintains this mythological consistency, even though linguistically there's so much change going on? That fascinates me. The idea that metaphysics, the idea that mythology is actually a more stable structure than language. Because I can understand, I can read English from hundreds of years ago, and I can understand what was going on. And at the same time, I can think, well, these people had a completely different outlook from me. They were fundamentalist Christians. They believed the earth was 6,000 years old. So they had all these ideas and a morality very different from my peers. I look at people around me, and morally, we have very little in common with Anglo-Saxons 400 years ago, or Normans 400 years ago, the English people. So the English language hasn't changed much. It's still mutually intelligible, but our metaphysics, our mythology, our ethos, and our ethics, that's changed massively. And because of that, I think that has caused us to view language as a more stable structure than morality. But at the long arc of history, that's not actually the case. It's actually the case that mythology is more of a stable structure than language itself, which points to something deeper about the fact that our language is not the most fundamental. The language itself is not the most fundamental thing. Actually, mythology is something that precedes language. Stories actually precede the language that we use to describe the story, which is pretty amazing. And the way I would put this in terms of a metaphor that people can understand is that dreams precede the language required to describe the dream. So you can have a dream and then you can describe it with language using Italian, German, Greek. But the dream and the ability for people to dream actually comes before our ability to linguistically represent the dream and to describe it to one another. That's a powerful fact that is counterintuitive given the fact that English has changed so much over the last 4 centuries, or the English-speaking people, their morality has changed so much, but the language has not changed. That's counterintuitive. That goes counter to the broad historical trends. So we're living in a unique time in that respect, where linguistic change is relatively small compared to mythological change. This is an epoch of huge mythological cataclysm. We have had the same founding myth. Zeus versus the Titans. Odin versus the giants. Christ versus Satan. We've had 3 very similar mythological systems inherited from, ultimately, I would say, an Indo-European tradition. I guess we can dispute Christianity there, but what I'm saying is there is an Indo-European tradition that goes back at least 6,000 years, and perhaps that's inherited from something deeper and older, some kind of Eurasian tradition, I don't know. But it's a very old tradition that's been going on for a very long time, and all of a sudden, everything's changing very quickly. So this is not something that you see in society very often. Oftentimes you see linguistic changes, cultural changes. You know, the Hungarian people used to not speak Magyar, now they do speak Magyar. So linguistic changes happen all the time, but these fundamental mythological and metaphysical changes are less frequent. And that's not intuitive people. People think that you can speak the same language and have completely different mythologies. But I think that's something that's very much a feature of modern life and is not a constant if you look throughout history. It's more often the case that people have 2 completely different linguistic structures, but their mythological structures are extremely similar. That historically is the case. Whereas today you have people who with the same exact linguistic structure with completely different mythologies. I don't know, if someone has talked about that, I'm sure someone has addressed this. I want to hear someone who's talked about this and who's thought about it more than me. I didn't intend to talk about this during this video. The ideas just sort of come up as I talk. The voice isn't doing so great today, bit of a sore throat today. Hopefully it was bearable. And I hope this stimulated some ideas. The project that I was working on, the Deep Right project, is in a hiatus. But I still think it's a good idea. And I don't know what my output will be like. I can't predict the future at this point. Ideally, it would be great to produce a video every day. It's probably not going to happen. I mean, I would be happy at this point to do a video every week. You know, there's the ideal situation and then there's reality. But I basically see at this point the goal, the telos that I have, is I want to get to a point where this Deep Right project, this academic project, which I think is the worthwhile thing that people should be doing, I think to get back to that, to get back on track, people need to be drawn in and they need to be convinced of basic assumptions, basic axioms. Things like mythology is more important than democracy. You know, if you have white people who believe in a certain mythology, they believe in a certain metaphysic. For instance, the myth of decline, the idea that in the past we had a golden age and now we're declining, that would be so much more powerful than getting white people to vote 55% for Trump or something like that. Ultimately, democracy is fleeting. The advantages, the protections of democracy, they come and go. They're like the words written in the wind and the water. They come and go, they're fleeting, they're not lasting, they're not stable. It might feel good in the moment to win a democratic election, but really, in the long term, if you want to survive in the long term, you need to be thinking mythologically, and that's where academics comes in, a serious understanding of mythology. Because the only way you're going to be able to sustain or to bring back or to recreate or refashion, remold a mythology that's sustainable for the future is if you have some understanding of it. And there has to be an academic understanding, because it's so complex what's gone on now. You need people who are able to deal with multiple levels of thinking, who are not just a radical traditionalist who just, tries to recreate that. There's a difference between just trying to follow a biblical commandment or to take a laundry list of commandments and just follow each one to the letter, and to actually have a living, breathing tradition. So someone can say, well, the Norse pagans, they wore horned helmets, so we're going to put on horned helmets. This is actually what people in the 19th century in England were doing. And J.R.R. Tolkien was actually part of this movement, loosely, of people who would literally go around wearing horned helmets, or they would draw pictures of people wearing horned helmets. This reimagining doesn't work. You can't just take the ancient past and say, well, look, yeah, a lot of things have changed, but we're just going to go back to that. We're just going to go back to being Paleolithic or Neolithic people living off the land. It doesn't work. You can't just ignore everything that's happened. You have to take it, you have to incorporate it, and you have to deal with it in a way that makes sense. You have to make sense out of something that currently doesn't make a whole lot of sense from the perspective of most people. So you have to make sense of it. That's the job of mythology. It's making sense of the world. And I think that is the worthwhile project. That's what I'm trying to convince people. So hopefully, if I can convince enough people of that, and I have so many people who are commenting saying, I'm too stupid to help. Like, I like what you're doing, but I'm too stupid. It's like, come on. Come on. This idea that it's almost like a Dunning-Kruger thing. That and people have accused me of the Dunning-Kruger, where they say, well, you think you're smarter than you actually are, and that could be true. That could be true. It definitely is true in terms of scientific matters. Anything having to do with HBD and intelligence, things like that. It's not my skill set. But other people, I hear people commenting, making a very long, intelligent defense of why they are too stupid to contribute anything. It's like, well, why didn't you just spend that time, energy, and intelligence actually doing something productive, creative, positive, than just ragging on yourself, saying you're too stupid? I get that far too much. People who are negative. You can't just be purely negative. You can't just say everything's lost and everything is destroyed. We have to think outside of this pigeonhole of democracy. We can't just think in terms of the next election. Now, I'm not saying we should therefore not care. There's a difference between going beyond democracy and being like, I think the Distributist just made a video, why I will never vote. I'm not saying never vote. I'm going to be voting. You should vote. We should all vote. It's only 15 minutes to vote. Everyone should vote who watches my videos. But in terms of voting, no, let me rephrase that. Everyone should vote who likes and comments on my videos. Like and comment. Watching is not enough. That's when you win the right to vote. But democracy is not enough. I'm saying we have to go beyond democracy. Not saying that we ignore democracy. Not saying that we say, oh, it's all hopeless, like Trump versus Clinton, it's all the same. It's not the same. Trump versus Clinton, there is a difference. And we should vote for the better candidate. We should vote for the lesser of two evils. We should vote for them because we don't want a situation of censorship. We don't want a situation where we can't speak, in which we are silenced. Because mythology is the most important thing, we need to be able to discuss mythology freely. And the moment that someone comes along and they are able to censor us, that destroys our ability to reformulate and to talk about and to dissect and understand mythology. So that's important. We need to elect the more free speech candidate, and I think that was Donald Trump. And so I'm glad he won, and I hope he wins again. And I hope we get an even better free speech candidate in the future. But if democracy fails, we still have something that we need to work on. If we get to the point where Texas turns blue, there's still some things that we need to do. And even if that's not as public, even if it's not YouTube videos, there's still something that needs to be done. And so that's why I think this decentralized academic model, which is really very similar in a sense to medieval scholasticism and the medieval cathedral universities and the medieval, I mean, it's really going back to basis and saying, no, we're not going to copy the modern day universities. Modern day universities are over bloated. They're very top heavy. You know, the people who are administrators are paid the biggest salaries, and there's not a lot of focus on actual education. It's really a sham. So I'm not saying let's copy them and become the right-wing version of the universities. No, I'm saying we go back to the origin of the universities, where they came from. That's the medieval scholastic system, which was a decentralized system with monasteries and cathedrals. We can go back to that. That's a very stable system. That's a system which is extremely anti-fragile and would be very hard to destroy, as opposed to like some top-down think tank. Some people say the right wing needs a think tank. The Trump movement needs a think tank. We don't need a think tank. We need a decentralized scholastic model. And that's what I promote. And I'm going to keep pushing for that as long as it is legal to be a white male and to still speak, I guess, in the words of Lindsey Graham. I'm going to keep speaking if that's okay. And when it's not okay, I'll still be doing something. You might not hear about it. But this is what I'm pushing for. We need to have a solution to what seems like inevitable censorship. I think it's probably inevitable that a Democrat will become president and they will begin censoring people in a way that we have never seen since World War II. We're going to see people like Francis Parker Yockey was jailed. He was thrown in jail for his ideas. We're going to see that happen again. We're going to see sedition trials. And it might be because of a war with Russia. We might go to war with Russia, and all of a sudden, I'm going to be thrown in jail for seditious charges. But I want people to be reached. I want an audience to be reached. And so that some people who aren't ready to speak out, they see that happening, and they learn from our mistakes, and they don't go to jail themselves, but they learn and they begin this underground scholastic academic model, which you could even compare to the Freemasons. That would be very similar. Or you would have people who were crypsis. They were practicing crypsis. They would pretend on the surface that they were just ordinary citizens, but in secret, in private, they would be organizing these mythological constructions, deconstructions, discussions. And that's the way they would sustain the memory of the Indo-European civilization. And you look at history, you look at certain minority groups who were on the down and out. They were sort of kicked out of their homelands. They were an oppressed people. And eventually they came back. But that took a long time, and throughout that period, they needed some method of mythological preservation. They needed some method of remembering the past in order to maintain their identity. That's going to happen. That's going to have to happen again if a political solution becomes impossible. I don't believe a military solution is possible. So there's a lot of different possible scenarios. I mean, we could have the singularity. We could have robots taking over everything. But if that doesn't happen, we have to have another plan. We have to have a plan to sustain ourselves. I mean, if Trump becomes the emperor and deports 30 million illegal immigrants or whatever, that was a solution that was touted. I obviously wouldn't be crying tears if it happened. I don't think it's very likely. So sort of in between, we can't, like we have to look at what's actionable and not actionable. God Emperor Trump is not something that's actionable. We can elect him, we can support him, but we can't make that crazy scenario actually happen. We can wish, pray, whatever. That's not actionable. Artificial intelligence is not actionable. I can't make it happen. I'm not an inventor. I'm not a programmer. I'm not going to make artificial intelligence happen. So those two situations for me are not actionable. God, Emperor Trump, and artificial intelligence. So I don't think about them very much in the sense of what should I do in terms of ethically, what's the right action, what I should be doing. those are not actionable scenarios. What is actionable is a case where either we can speak openly or we have to speak secretly, esoterically, about mythology, because I think that's where real power is held. So I'm going to keep pushing in that direction, and hopefully it might be years from now, but hopefully this scholastic project will get up off its feet to the point where it doesn't need my help, or it doesn't need any other individuals, that it's become so dispersed. It's become this loose network, this self-sustaining, self-reproducing priestly cell, a monastic, not in terms of being an ascetic, although it could be ascetic. I'm not excluding that, but it doesn't have to be an ascetic network. But these little cells, they're self-reproducing. They don't need me anymore. So I could die or be thrown in jail, and it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter because they would live on. So that's what I'm trying to push towards. Agree, disagree, let me know, and I'm going to try to come up with an argument to better express why this is necessary in light of this recent discussion about proprietarianism. I just think this warrior solution is not possible, military solution not possible, not feasible, for reasons that other people have argued better than I have. And a merchant solution where you just get a bunch of money and you outspend Sheldon Adelson, I don't think that's possible either, because of the fact that financial power is concentrated in a monopoly group that shares wealth through insider trading, and they block out other people from coming into that system on ideological grounds. So if you're pro-white, you just can't join that group. So I don't think that's possible either. But again, if someone wants to try to become rich, then I'm like, hey, if that's your thing, if you love money, then I'm not going to stop you. Although I would try to stop people who are going to say, let's violently do something. I would always discourage that, because if let's say someone who's pro-white, they try to become rich, that doesn't hurt me. If you start a business and you try to get a lot of money, it doesn't hurt me. But if you do something violent, the government can use that as an excuse to shut down my free speech. So I definitely will speak out against these proprietarian, violent people. I'm not going to speak out against someone who wants to make a lot of money. I just don't think that's a solution politically, culturally, civilizationally. And I just watched the John David Ebert with, what's his name? JF. And I'm continuously surprised about how much this guy knows off the top of his head. He was talking about the Greeks, and he was talking about Crassus, and how Crassus was basically Donald Trump, and Crassus was a real estate dealer. He made a lot of money, and he was so rich he could buy his own private army. And ultimately, that wasn't a solution to Roman decline. It was a symptom of Roman decline. So I don't think just making a lot of money is going to be a solution out of this scenario. And I think that sort of thinking itself is a symptom of where we are today, the depraved state that we are in today. So I don't think that's a solution. But yeah, go ahead, like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.